Hi, welcome to Knit with Hannah. I'm Hannah. Today we're going to figure out whether you're knitting too loosely and if you are, what to do about it. Hi, welcome to Knit with Hannah. I'm Hannah. I'm here with Knitting Natter to help you learn to knit the easy way. Yes, what does that mean if you're knitting too loosely? It means that the stitches are too far apart, they're too big, nothing really works. But how do you know if this is actually happening? Because you've got nothing to compare it to. Well, there are a couple of things, a couple of clues that you might have alongside your knitting that will really help you. So first of all, you're going to sit there and think, every knitting pattern in the world is wrong. What is it? Every time I knit something, it's too big. I'm following the rules, I'm following the pattern, everything's going right, I'm using the right needles, I'm using the right yarn, I'm following the right size, and it always ends up too big. Pattern's fault, not my problem, I just can't knit. Don't give up. So what you might notice is that the sleeves are too long if you're knitting a cardigan, maybe it just bags underneath the arms and it ends up looking much longer than it does in the photograph, down to your hips instead of down to your waist or something like that. And if you're knitting a hat for a 10-year-old, then maybe it fits a teenager instead. That can be the problem. You're knitting something and it ends up too big. The other big problem, and again this is going to help you think that every knitting pattern in the world is wrong, you do not have enough yarn. You get the right number of balls, you get the right weight of yarn, you get everything right for the size that you want to knit. And guess what? You don't have enough. Every time it works out like this, and you just have to go and find or source more yarn, and you think, this knitting game is too much. I'm fed up with it. It all ends up too big. Always run out of yarn, can't be bothered anymore. It could be this simple problem that you're knitting too loosely. So I've got a couple of tips in the tutorial for you, and then I'm going to come back and give you some more ideas on how to sort this out as well. So first things first, let's go over to the tutorial and I'll show you how to knit more tightly because you're knitting too loosely. If you find you've got loose knitting, you'll see that the stitches look quite big and clumpy, sat on the needle, moving up and down quite a lot. They may even fall off your needles more often than you might think they should. And the stitches will look a bit uneven as well. That one is much longer than the ones over here. Again, this one's a bit shorter and that one's a bit longer. Let's work out why it's loose and what we can do about it. So first of all, what might be happening is that unlike last week when we were talking about knitting too tightly, you might actually be knitting too far away from the tips so that your needles are like that when you're creating a stitch. You've got them so far apart, you're so far away from the tips that you're pulling the yarn around, and you've got to actually do quite a bit of manoeuvring to get that stitch through. Slightly exaggerating that there, but then you're moving that one and you've got to do that. And this one, and you've got to get that yarn out and move it across there. So you may be just too far from the tips. Try and knit so that you're not too far from the tips. Yes, you're in a place where it's the right size, because right at the tip here, you're going to be actually a smaller size needle than it is along the needle further in the actual size you want. So try and knit much closer to the tips so that you've got a better chance of getting the right size that you're looking for. Okay, the other thing is, and you may have seen as I was creating those first stitches, I was letting go of the yarn when I was making each stitch. So that's the needle pulling that yarn out, and there's nothing holding that yarn to make it tight or any even tension. So I just make the next stitch and I've dropped it, and I'm not pulling on it to make it tighter, I'm not giving it an even tension, I'm just letting it go, and then I'm making the next stitch. So that might be a problem. If you hold on to the yarn in between stitches, and you can hold it in your right hand or your left hand, I will send you to a video up here which talks about the different knitting styles, and I always use the one where I wrap the yarn just around my little finger, so that gives me a bit of tension. It's just there holding it, not too tight, and I can just pull those fingers together, not too tight, not too loose, and then I just move it underneath the other fingers and over the forefinger. And the forefinger is the one that tells the yarn where to go. That's in charge. So every time I make a stitch, there's the tension here at the forefinger, but it's also being held in place by the tension where it's wrapped just once around the little finger. So that gives it a much more even tension, and every single stitch feels pretty much the same. There you go. So in, around, pull the needle through, off of the left hand needle, and then you make the next stitch in exactly the same way, and it feels so much easier, and it feels like a really even tension. That's cool. So all of those stitches feel the same, and you can bet if you start knitting like that over time, the tension will become more even throughout the whole piece. So we've got not holding the yarn, and there could also be the fact that you think you're holding it, but it's not really in a good enough way to hold an even tension. So the stitches aren't that even though you think that you're holding it in an even way. So just think about that as you're knitting. How does it feel? That you're just that kind of person, you know, laid back, easy. I'm happy knitting, it's fine. And if you're knitting a long scarf, it doesn't matter what size it is, you're happy with it being looser, that's fine. But please note, you could run out of yarn. This is the biggest problem with loose knitting, is that because you're using more yarn for each stitch, so you would run out of yarn if the pattern is just on the edge of saying, oh, we can do that with that amount of yarn, we won't need another ball. So just be aware that could be the problem. So what else might it be? It could well be that you're using needles that are too big. It could be that simple. And you've thought, no, it doesn't matter, it will come out fine, I'm using the right yarn, doesn't really matter. Or you've just picked up the wrong pair by mistake. Have you picked up a pair that's just a couple of sizes bigger? See, you wouldn't see the difference. You wouldn't think there was so much of a difference, but that's a 4.5 and that's a 6.5. Even a 5.5mm needle would make a difference. And it's just because you picked the wrong ones up. It could also be that you picked up what you think is a pair, one of them is bigger, one of them is smaller. So it just feels a bit off for every other row because one of them feels a bit looser and then the next row feels fine. So just think about that too. Okay, that was a few tips for you, and at the beginning I said I've got some more tips for you now. So here we go. First of all, guess what? Practice, practice, practice. You don't learn to play a piano concerto without practicing every day, but this should take you much less time than practicing to play some kind of Beethoven concerto. It will basically just be relearning a bit of your knitting. You know how to do the knit stitch, you know how to do the purl stitch already. You're just relearning a little bit of how you make stitches. So first of all, I've got a couple of videos for you. Go and watch What to Knit for Beginners, because that will just give you a few pieces to knit through. Give yourself a couple of weeks and just knit through a few beginner pieces, and also go and watch Knitting Stitches for Beginners. Knitting Stitches for Beginners is an ideal way to cast on, hold the yarn in your hand nicely so that it's got a really even tension, and then I'll show you the knit stitch and the purl stitch in that tutorial as well. But those two tutorials combined will give you some ideas on what you can knit just with some medium yarn, some medium needles. Don't get too fussy over this, just plain yarn, plain needles. You can knit yourself a set of coasters, you can knit a friend a bookmark, just knit yourself a small scarf as well. It could be that simple. Smartphone case, purse, that kind of thing. And just make sure that you feel okay with it. It doesn't feel too complicated, you haven't got to focus on it too much. If you practice it for a couple of weeks, you'll notice that the stitches get closer together, the stitches are smaller and more even. That's the problem with loose knitting. Sometimes the stitches, like I showed you on my needle in the tutorial, they can be large at one end of the needle and then a bit smaller, and they get large again, and it just doesn't really sit very happily on the needle. You'll have a much more even tension if you're holding the yarn like I suggest in that tutorial, and if you practice it. The other thing you might want to do is to learn a bit more about even tension when you're knitting, and I will put the link to a course that I've got down below in the description. It's called Intuitive Knitting, and this is going to help you with the tension in your knitting, with the reading of the patterns, with all sorts of things, but it will help you with knitting swatches, understanding, making sure that your stitches are the right size compared to the pattern and compared to a general even tension as well, that it might be stated on the ball band, that kind of thing. Now, I'm not someone who says you have to knit a swatch for everything that you knit, but that's just me. If you can learn about knitting tension and holding your yarn so that your knitting isn't far too loose and it isn't far too tight, then you will get to the point where it's about the right size. We can be far too perfectionist about knitting tension, and then we can switch needle sizes and switch yarns and everything can completely go wrong, and then we won't end up knitting at all. So if you're at all worried about this, then just spend 6 months knitting things that don't matter that much about size. Maybe always get an extra ball of yarn for everything that you knit, and you'll realise, having practiced these smaller things, having practiced knitting with an even tension, you won't be needing that extra ball of yarn anymore. If you've been knitting loosely, you've possibly been doing this anyway, and suddenly you'll say, hey, I'm using the right amount of yarn because my knitting tension is even. That's all it is. Knitting loosely can mean that you're just not really on par at all with what the designer's suggesting, with what the pattern's suggesting, with how everyone else knits. And like I said, we don't want to be perfectionist about knitting, but we do want to be knitting not too loosely, not too tightly, but a nice Goldilocks knitting somewhere in the middle. That's enough talking about tension. Enough. We'll get back to some other subjects next week. I will see you again soon. Thank you so much for joining me today. Bye for now. Happy knitting.